Margaret, in answer to the last question, why does the government have to wait 12 months to do anything? They park everything for 12 months, no matter what we bring before the House. But I want to welcome the bill and thank Sinn Féin for bringing it to the House. Watching the ongoing housing crisis and specifically the issues in the private renter sector, in the crisis of tenants' rights, security of tenure and rent security over the last 5 years has been really akin to watching a slow train crash. Everyone can see where we're headed, everyone can see what will happen, and everyone can see the consequences of that crash. Yet nothing, effectively nothing, has been done to stop or ameliorate that crash and its consequences. Instead, the government, in its responses, has at best played the part of providing emergency services to the crash, in effect sticking a plaster repeatedly over a gaping wound. One of the first things People Before Profit did when we were elected in 2016 was to address this crisis, or to attempt to address it with a bill, and specifically rents. We tried to get NAMA to prioritise providing public housing on public lands. We tried to stop rent increases and bring rents back to the connection with people's wages and inflation, and we called that bill HEMPI Bill, Housing Emergency Measures in Public Interest, and it was a deliberate play on the FEMPI Acts passed by Fianna Fáil and the Greens, and later Fine Gael and Labour government using it, because we wanted to highlight the absolute hypocrisy and double standards that surround the debates on rent freezes and rent issues generally. And let me remind some of the defenders of property rights here about the Constitution. Those legal experts here who faint when anyone mentions rent increase prohibitions, that the Constitution or its protection for property rights did not prevent major parties from dipping into the pensions of the public sector and other workers via the FEMPI Acts in 2010, from 2010 onwards. They didn't shirk behind constitutional niceties when it came to bailing out the banks. They justified it by calling the acts that permitted it emergency legislation. We had a financial crisis, so we permitted the trouncing of private property rights, which is what pensions are. We have a housing crisis, a crisis that is blighting a whole generation, a crisis that sees families roaming our streets while trying to access emergency accommodation, a crisis that sees record-breaking numbers of people sleeping rough, a crisis that sees record-breaking numbers of people dying on our streets from homelessness, a crisis that sees people terrified of the next rent increase or receiving a notice to quit from their landlord, and a crisis that sees gleeful prospective brochures from investors, from investor funds, telling them that things can only get better. But the same voices and the same ministers who bravely ignored property rights when it came to the financial emergency legislation are vocal defenders of property rights when it comes to the housing crisis. Now, I believe the constitutional argument is bogus entirely. We can, if we have the political will to do so, legislate to ban or limit rent increases and to confer greater security of tenure for tenants. There have been many legal and constitutional experts who have stated this clearly, and I won't go over that again here now, we don't have time. But the question is, why have we never done so until attempting to do so now? Why has this been used time and time again to pretend that we can't legislate to protect people from the enormous burden that the current rents are having on them and their families? We've pointed out before in this House the large and disproportionate numbers of TDs who are landlords and who have vested interests. Indeed, many are the same ones that often pretend that they are supporting ordinary people or the poor rural communities, while they also amass millions in rents and other business ventures. That might be one reason, but I also believe it's deeper and goes to the very nature and the foundation of this state. The obsession with property rights lies at the heart of the nature of our elite and privilege in this country. Since the state's foundation, the elite and their public representatives in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were different from other elites in other nations. They did not get their wealth and their privilege from manufacturing or from industry by and large. Their biggest source of wealth for the Irish elite has always been property. And I think the fetish around property rights stems from that fact, from the material base that property and wealth generate, and the wealth generated from property has played. And those days must end. And I think change is coming, and it's clear that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are being dragged into that. But I think if we are to address the nature and the causes of the housing crisis, we're going to need to push hard over the next few years. We're going to need a mass movement to tell the landlord parties that the days of their rule are coming to an end, and people will not put up with a housing system that's built for developers and landlords, or a private rental sector that's built for and on behalf of an elite and wealthy, but is there to provide a basic human right in an affordable and secure manner for all people in this country. One last point I would make, that this crisis in rental accommodation, in housing generally, is being used by far-right and fascist parties to spread hatred and division, and we've seen this in the by-election. We've seen material that claims that we have a housing crisis because we have too many immigrants, not because we have too many greedy landlords and developers and failures of political parties that have failed to address basic human rights. The far right have been allowed to do this with the cover of the government. The government parties have let them off the hook and have fallen hook, line and sinker into the trap of allowing others being used as an excuse for hatred and division in this country. And no more so can you see that when landlords have been allowed to impose rent increases of up to 8% under the newly discovered loophole as the COVID-19 rent freezes end. So shame on this government. I want to again thank Sinn Féin for putting the bill and oppose any attempt by the government to stop it going forward.